All right, today we're diving into what is, no joke, one of the most pivotal moments in Western history, the Council of Trent. This is a story of crisis, a massive comeback, and the total reshaping of a global institution. An institution whose changes we still feel today. So yeah, let's get right into it.
So let's just start with this question, right? Imagine an institution, one that's been around for like 1,500 years. It's dominated an entire continent, and then all of a sudden, its very foundations are shaken to the core. What do? How do you possibly survive something like that? Well, that is exactly the situation the Catholic Church found itself in back in the 16th century. Okay, so to really get a grip on the Council of Trent, you first have to understand the crisis that made it necessary in the first place. We're talking about a full-blown religious earthquake here, something we now call the Protestant Reformation.
And look, this was not some minor academic debate. You had figures like Martin Luther who were questioning everything, the church's authority, its core teachings, the whole shebang. And this sparked absolute turmoil. We're talking about kingdoms, families, entire communities being torn apart. It forced the church into this defensive crouch, something it hadn't had to do for centuries.
So, the big question is, how did the church officially respond? Well, they called a huge, highly organized, and incredibly ambitious meeting, the Council of Trent. This was it. This was their moment to regroup, to push back, and to figure out the future of Catholicism.
And just take a look at this timeline. This was not some quick weekend conference, okay? The council met on and off for 18 years. Just let that sink in. 18 years. That alone tells you just how deep and complicated the problems were. They had to methodically work their way through centuries of doctrine and practice, piece by painful piece.
So the council basically had two massive jobs on its plate. The first, and you could argue it was the most important, was to draw a really clear line in the sand. They had to define, with zero ambiguity, what it meant to be Catholic in this new, fractured world.
And right at the very heart of the whole debate was this one critical concept: justification. Now that sounds like a fancy theological term, but it really boils down to the most human question there is. How am I saved? This one idea. This was the central battleground between the Catholics and the new Protestant reformers.
And this really lays out the divide perfectly. On one side, you have the Protestant view, sola fide, which means faith alone. The idea was that faith, and only faith, was the key to salvation. But the Council of Trent came back hard, saying, no, that's not the whole story. They affirmed the long-standing Catholic position, salvation comes from a combination of faith and good works. You had to actively cooperate with God's grace. But they didn't just stop there. Oh no. Another huge point of disagreement was the sacraments. A lot of the reformers were saying, hey, there are only two that really count. The church? They came back with a very definitive number.
Yep, they reaffirmed all 7 of them. And what's really fascinating is why this was such a big deal. By saying these physical rituals were essential signs of God's grace, the council was basically doubling down. They were reinforcing the idea that the church itself, with its priests, with its practices, was the essential bridge between God and humankind.
And finally, we get to the issue of authority. Who's in charge? Here, the council left no room for doubt. They made their position crystal clear. First, they shot down the Protestant idea of Scripture alone. They said, nope, it's both the Bible and the Church's sacred tradition that hold the truth. And second, they came out strongly for the authority of the Pope and declared the Latin Vulgate as the one official Bible. This move basically locked in the Church's entire top-down structure.
Okay, but defending doctrine, that was only half the battle. The leaders of the church, they weren't naive. They knew they had to clean up their own act. They had to admit that, yeah, a lot of the reformers' complaints about corruption were actually spot on. So the council decided to tackle those problems head on.
And a perfect example of this, the sale of indulgences. You know, the very thing that was one of the original sparks of the whole Reformation. Now, the council didn't get rid of indulgences completely, but they did strongly condemn all the shady business surrounding them. They made it absolutely clear their purpose was spiritual, not, a cash grab for the church.
The council also put the clergy under a microscope. They knew that any real renewal had to start with the leadership. So they didn't just talk, they took real concrete steps. They ordered seminaries to be built for proper priest training, they demanded better education and discipline for all clergy, and they told bishops, you have to actually live in the place you're supposed to be leading. These weren't just suggestions, they were powerful, practical reforms.
All this energy, all this new clarity that came out of the Council of Trent, well, it sparked a huge revival movement across the entire Catholic world. We call this period the Counter-Reformation, and it's what essentially gave birth to the modern Catholic Church as we think of it today.
I mean, this council really lit a fire under the church. All of a sudden, you have these new, incredibly energetic religious orders popping up, like the Jesuits, who just became absolute champions of education and missions. Art and architecture just exploded in this dramatic, emotional style we call Baroque, all of it designed to make you feel awe and devotion. And all that new energy, it fueled a massive wave of global missionary work that spread Catholicism everywhere, from the Americas all the way to Asia.
So what's the bottom line here? What did this all add up to? Well, the decisions from the council forged a church with a much, much clearer identity. It now had a super-defined doctrine, a clergy that was way better educated and more disciplined, a standardized mass that would stick around for the next 400 years, and this powerful spiritual renewal that just swept through everyday people.
And just think about this for a second. The model of the Catholic Church that came out of Trent, we're talking its structure, its beliefs, its whole identity, it stayed pretty much the same all the way up until the 1960s. That is 400 years of stability. The impact was, to put it mildly, absolutely massive and incredibly long-lasting.
And that really brings us to the council's complicated legacy, doesn't it? On the one hand, it was a huge success. It united and re-energized the Catholic Church. But in drawing those super clear lines, it also poured concrete on the divisions within Christianity, divisions that, let's be honest, are still very much with us today. So it's this powerful story of both unity and division, with echoes that we can still hear almost 500 years later.